Okay, so I guess everybody knows Raga. We're here for his defense. Committee is John, Jason, Manny, Katrina, and me. That's for everybody, right? And then, so I guess feel free to ask some questions during, but clarifying that we'll ask mostly questions afterwards. And then once the audience asks questions afterwards, we'll ask everybody to leave and we'll do the committee questions. So, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Thank you everyone for coming to my defense. So my thesis is on characterizing distribution rules for cost-sharing games. And today we'll be in the world of distributed resource allocation problems. So here's a broad theme for this problem domain. The task is to allocate scarce resources to distributed agents such that some objective function is optimized. Now, as I said, this is a very broad description, and there are a lot of tons of examples that fall under this category, and I will highlight a lot of them in the course of this talk. Okay, but let me start with a very simple example of network formation games. So here you have a network of nodes with two source destination pairs marked. And so S1 seeks connectivity with D1, S2 seeks connectivity with D2. The dotted edges represent edges that could be built if so desired, right? And the problem is, given cost functions on each of the edges, so the numbers on the edges denote how much it costs to build that edge, can you find the least cost network that will satisfy the connectivity constraints, right? So if you think of this in a centralized framework, this is nothing but the minimum Steiner tree problem, and the optimal network turns out to be this of cost 10. You could just build the optimal network and recover this cost from S1 and S2 in some way, right? That's a policy decision. But what's the problem with this? This turns out to be an NP-hard problem to solve. And not only that, centralized solutions in general are not scalable, and they suffer from reliability problems, and so on. But on top of this, agents here are people. And so not everybody may be happy with the outcome that a central authority is going to impose on them. Right? So let's look at a distributed solution where we let sources play a non-cooperative game among themselves by choosing the edges they want and just paying for those edges. So the question then becomes, how do you share the cost of the common edge? Right? Suppose S1 and S2 both choose the middle edge. How do they share the cost of 6 units? And in the next few slides, I'm going to try and convince you that the outcome of this game is going to critically depend on how the cost of common resource, the common edge is shared. Okay, so let's take the first option. Let's say if both of them choose that edge, then S1 pays 5 and S2 pays 1. In this case, you can see that both sources choosing their direct edges to their destinations is the Nash equilibrium. It costs you $12, and it is obviously suboptimal. Right? And why is this a Nash equilibrium? It's because neither of them can unilaterally change their action and do better. And here's the second option where the cost is divided equally, right? Each pays $3. And in this case, the optimal network turns out to be a Nash equilibrium, right? So the cost sharing rule determines what is going to be the outcome of these games. So for that reason, we call these such games cost sharing games. And not only do they arise in network formation, another important example where they arise is facility location, where residents in the neighborhood have to decide where they want a facility to be located and how to split the cost of opening that facility. And there is also multi-project management, where there's a bunch of researchers who want to choose what projects they want to work on and how to divide the revenue that's generated on those projects. So the common feature of all these examples is that the distribution rules used to share the global cost or revenue determine the player's local utility functions. right? And from now on, instead of saying cost or revenue all the time, I'm going to use a common term called welfare, which I'll use to denote either revenue or negative of the cost, right? So it's always going to be welfare maximization from now on. Right? So the distribution rules determine the player's local utility functions and therefore the outcome. So our goal is going to be to design distribution rules that result in a desirable outcome, right? And I'll explain a little bit now about what desirable could mean, but I'll make it more concrete later after the model. So the goal of this thesis is to characterize the space of all distribution rules that result in a desirable outcome for a broad class of cost-sharing games. Right? So I don't want a design that is tailored to a very particular game instance. Right? So for the purposes of this thesis, my focus for my interpretation of desirable is going to be stable. Right? So by stable, I mean that in the outcome that emerges, all the players are in some kind of an equilibrium. Right? Broadly, everybody is happy with what's going on. And then the secondary desirable properties could be, efficiency, tractability, and so on. Okay. All right. So I have worked on other projects during my time here as well, but I decided to write my thesis only on the cost-sharing part so that it's a coherent treatment, and the thesis is kind of self-contained in a broader sense. Right? But so I'll quickly go through a few variations that I've worked on before coming back to this problem. Right? So one problem that I've looked at is a scenario where you have a heterogeneous multi-server system where you have servers that are people who can choose the rate at which they want to work selfishly in order to minimize some costs. And in such situations, I've looked at the impact of both scheduling as well as staffing on the behavior of the agents as well as the performance of the system. Another area that I've worked on is a content distribution network where you have a central server that holds a lot of objects, and there are end users who have different preferences over these objects, but they have limited cache. So they have to decide what objects to store in order to minimize some kind of an access cost. Right? So, and in this problem, I've looked at showing the existence of a Nash equilibrium and giving a polytime algorithm for computing the Nash equilibrium. And another interesting group of problems arises in the field of distributed control, where you may have problems like sensor coverage, wireless frequency selection, or wireless access point assignment. And in problems like this, the first thing that you notice is that there are no people that are involved, right? And the objective function is not cost or revenue, but some abstract performance measure, like maybe the detection probability of the sensor, or the speed or latency in the wireless network. And in such situations, an interesting approach is to pretend that agents are people and model them as players in a cost-sharing game. Right? So they share this abstract cost among themselves. And if you take up this approach, then tools from cost sharing, the design of distribution rules, are also useful here in designing the utility functions for these agents. So this approach is called game theory control, and I've worked on that for my master's thesis. The last variation that I want to say is something that's current work in progress, and this is an interesting problem that comes up in data center networks. Right, so here the problem roughly is, how do you allocate bandwidth among the flows between virtual machines of the same tenants in a data center, such that you satisfy both the performance objective as well as a fairness objective. Right? So this is joint work with folks at Stanford and Princeton. Okay, so coming back to this thesis, last time I used network formation as the example to take you through the model, So this time I thought it will be maybe a little fun and different. To use multi-project management as the running example, right? And if you haven't guessed from the pictures already, this is inspired by the characters from PhD Comics. Okay, so let's move on to the model, formal model. So I'm going to represent a cost-sharing game by this tuple, and that's a lot of symbols. So I'm going to go through each one of them. N is going to be the set of players, in this case researchers. R is going to be the set of resources or projects. AI denotes the action set of a player, by which I mean what are the choices that are available for a player to take. And in this case, if you zoom in on player 4, if he's thinking about what action he should choose, maybe he's thinking about whether he should work on project 1 alone or work on both projects 3 and 4. So in this case, I say that A4 is R1 and R3, R4. The next symbol is WR, which denotes the local welfare function of each resource R. Right? So that's going to say what is the welfare that's generated at a particular resource given the players who choose that resource. Okay? So as an example, if you look at R3, suppose players 4 and 6 are the only ones that chose that resource, then there's a welfare of W sub R3 of 4, 6 that's generated. And we're going to denote the global welfare by this script W, which is nothing but the sum of the local welfares that are generated everywhere. One more small piece of notation. I'm going to denote the set of all distinct local welfare functions by this W sub G, and this is just how you compute it. You just take every welfare function as a singleton set and just take the unit. Right? And the last item in our representation is FR, which denotes how this W is going to be split among the players that choose it. Right? So the notation is going to be, so player 4 is going to receive F sub R3 of 4, 4, 6. And player 6 is going to receive, similarly, F sub R3 of 6, 4, 6. Right? So how is this W distributed among 4 and 6? We're going to make a scalability assumption for our model, and this is because we want to extend our design to a broad class of games as opposed to a very specific game. So what we're saying is if the welfare functions at any two resources are identical, then the way they're distributed must also be identical. Okay? So that seems like a very reasonable thing to require from the model. And in light of this assumption, from now on, we're going to denote FR by FWR. Right? So what this assumption is saying is that the distribution rule does not depend on the identity of the resource, but it only depends on what you are distributing. Right? So I'm going to denote it by FWR. Now therefore, here what I have to specify is just FW for every distinct welfare function that I have. Okay? And as a shorthand notation for this, I'm going to denote that by F sub WG. Okay, so once we've specified the game, let's let the players, the researchers choose what projects they want to work on, and this results in an allocation A. So an allocation A is nothing but a tuple, an ordered tuple of the actions, of the choices of every player. And a player's overall utility is going to be the sum of their shares across each resource that they choose. Right? So if, once again, if we look at player 4, in this allocation, his action is R3 and R4. Right? So he has chosen these two resources, and therefore his utility U4 is going to be his share from R3 plus his share from R4. And the goal of this thesis is to come up with good designs for these distribution rules. So a few notes about the model before we move on. This is a very broad model that includes not just the 3 motivating scenarios that I showed you, but it also includes well-known classes of games like multicast games, congestion games, routing, coverage games, and so on, as special cases. Okay, so with the introduction of the model, we can now move towards formalizing the goal. Right? So our goal is going to be, given the set of players and the local welfare functions, design the local distribution rules that result in a desirable outcome, regardless of the specific set of resources and the action sets of the players. Right? So again, to reiterate, we're looking for, in some sense, we're looking for universal design that does not depend on the specific instance of the problem. Right? So to write this in formal terms, I'm going to introduce this class of games denoted by script G. This is the class of all games G with a fixed set of players N, set of local welfare functions. You can arbitrarily choose them from this set W. And once you choose the local welfare functions, you pick the corresponding local distribution rules from what we have designed. Right? So now the goal just becomes, given any N and W, I want to design this FW such that all games in this class are desirable. Right? So I've said desirable so many times now that I feel compelled to explain what that could mean. So let's look at what all the different things that desirable could mean. It could mean different things for different people. So when we talk about properties of a game, there are two kinds of properties, static and dynamic. So static properties talk about what the outcome of a game is going to be, and the dynamic properties talk about how players reach that outcome. Right? So perhaps the most important static property is stability. Right? So you want the outcome to be stable in some sense, and for the players to be in some sort of equilibrium. And for this, the tools that we use are equilibrium concepts right, from game theory. The next most important property is efficiency. You want the stable outcome to be efficient, and here the tools are common tools are price of anarchy and price of stability. Next, we come to budget balance. What this says is that I divide the welfare generated completely among the players. Right? There's no surplus, there's no deficit. Tractability. Right? As a computer scientist, I want my distribution rules to be polynomial time computable so that I can make decisions based on it. Right? And the last one is locality, by which I mean that the distribution rules are separable. So what does that mean? The welfare that's generated at a resource is split only among the players in that resource. Right? So that's what I mean by that. The reason that's in green is because our model already imposes that inherently, right, to begin with. And yeah, there could be others that I haven't listed here as well. Coming to dynamic properties, it would be nice if there existed distributed learning rules for the players that converge to one of the stable outcomes. It would be nice if those learning rules converge to the most efficient stable outcome. It would also be nice if they had good convergence rates, so how fast do they converge? And if those learning rules are actually simple and intuitive, like best response dynamics, for example. So these are all some good dynamic properties to have. Right? So, and as I said in the beginning when discussing the goal, the focus is going to be primarily on stability. Right? And as far as stability goes, the choice of the equilibrium concept is going to be pure Nash equilibrium. So what is a pure Nash equilibrium? So here's the formal definition, but what it says is no player can unilaterally deviate and do better in a pure Nash equilibrium outcome. Okay. So I should mention there are other equilibrium concepts you could use, not just pure Nash. You could use dominant strategy, mixed Nash, correlated, coarse correlated, and so on. Now, once you have an equilibrium concept pinned down, you can now talk about what efficiency means for this particular equilibrium concept. So, price of anarchy is defined as, it's a worst case measure. So you're comparing the optimum welfare to the welfare of the worst Nash equilibrium. And price of stability is the opposite of it. you compare the optimal welfare with the best Nash equilibrium, right? Because there could be more than one Nash equilibrium in a game. So recall our goal, which says that given any n and w, I want to design distribution rules such that all games in this class are desirable. I'm just going to substitute desirable with possess a pure Nash equilibrium. Okay, so before we go start designing new distribution rules, let's look at what distribution rules are already there in literature and see how they perform. Right? So the first distribution rule I want to talk about is the Shapley value. So this actually came out of cost-sharing literature in cooperative game theory in the 50s. So this Shapley value says that a player's share of the welfare should depend on their average marginal contribution. Right? So this is the expression for that. I don't expect you to parse it, but a few things. So I'm going to use this notation, F sub SV sup W, to mean the Shapley value distribution rule on the welfare W. Right? So that's going to be my notation from here on. The subscript is going to denote the specific type of distribution rule I'm talking about, and the superscript is the welfare function on which it's being applied. Okay. So coming back to the Shapley value, here let me give you some intuition for how you get this monstrous expression. So you imagine the players in the set S arriving one at a time to the resource in some order. Okay. Now, when player I arrives, depending on when he arrived, he will see some subset of players who are already present, who have arrived before him. Right? And then player I can be thought of as contributing this marginal to the welfare. And then the Shapley value is player I's expected marginal contribution over all S factorial possible orders, assuming that each order is equally likely. Right? So if you work this out, you get this. So as an example, when all players are identical or indistinguishable, your Shapley value just reduces to equal share. Right, now let's pull up our laundry list and look at what properties the Shapley value satisfies. It turns out that it guarantees that any game has a pure Nash equilibrium. But it goes beyond that. It gives us all of these nice, wonderful dynamic properties as well. And the reason it does that is because the Shapley value results in a special class of games, which are called potential games. Right? So a potential game is a game where there is a player-independent function phi called the potential function, which encodes unilateral deviations by any player. Right? So you have one player-independent function that encodes the relevant information of everybody's Euclidean function. Right? So this is the formal definition for that. Okay, so coming back to Shapley values properties, so it guarantees that you get a potential game. How does it do on efficiency? Well, it's a gray area because you have both pluses and minuses. It turns out that Shapley value is optimal in some specific settings like network coding and network formation, but at the same time there is a lower bound of 2 on both the price of anarchy and price of stability for submodular welfare functions. It is budget balanced, so that's good. And when it comes to tractability, though, it requires computing exponentially many marginal contributions. Right? If you remember that example, you had to take expectation over all as factorial orders, and that's an exponential complexity. And so in general, it's intractable. Okay, so we're gonna, before moving on to one more distribution rule that I want to talk about, we'll look at a couple of extensions of the Shapley value that also have similar properties. So the first generalization of the Shapley value that I'll discuss is weighted Shapley value. And again, so I'm using WSV as the abbreviation. And it's parameterized by a vector of strictly positive player weights. So each player gets a weight omega I. Right? So and I always indicate the parameter in square brackets. So the weighted Shapley value is, again, the expected marginal contribution of the player, but it's according to a probability distribution that now depends on these player weights with full support on all orders, right? So intuitively, you can think of it as players with higher weights are more likely to arrive first than players with lower weights. And the generalized weighted Shapley value is a further generalization. And in addition to a vector of player weights, it also has another parameter, which is an ordered partition of the set of players. So it takes groups of players and prioritizes them, right? And this is also turns out to be defined in this way. So it is also the expected marginal contribution according to a probability distribution that depends on the weights. But now it has support only on those orders that respect this ordered partition. So what I mean by respect that sigma is players in Si arrive before players in Sj whenever I is less than j. So if an order doesn't respect that, then the probability assigned to that is 0. Okay. So these two generalizations, they lead to weighted and generalized weighted potential games, respectively. And their properties are similar to those of the Shapley value. Now let's move on to another distribution rule, which is the marginal contribution. And according to the marginal contribution, a player's share of the welfare is simply his marginal contribution to the welfare. Note that this is different from the order-specific marginal contribution I was talking about before. So this is just very simple. It just says, what is the welfare when everybody in S is present? And you take off the welfare when everybody except I is present, right? And again, I will not discuss them in detail, but you can think of similar extensions like weighted and generalized weighted marginal contributions, and it's the same parameterization, so I will not be talking about that. Okay, so what does the marginal contribution family of distribution rules, what properties do they satisfy? It turns out they also guarantee a potential gain. And not only that, they guarantee that the potential function is the same as the welfare function. And why is this important? For finite games, it turns out that the set of pure Nash equilibria coincides with the set of local maxima of the potential function. And therefore, this means that you get a price of stability of 1 here. But unfortunately, the price of anarchy can be arbitrarily bad. It is not budget balanced in general, only for a very small class of W's. If your welfare functions are linear, then it is, but not in general. And it is tractable, right? Why? Because it just requires computing one marginal contribution as opposed to exponentially many for the Shapley value. So here's the big research question before us now. Are there distribution rules besides Shapley value and marginal contribution? Right? I showed you these two families of distribution rules that guarantee Nash equilibrium. Are there others that always guarantee a pure Nash equilibrium? If so if there are other rules, then we could analyze them. Maybe they provide better trade-offs for desirable properties. If not, we can optimize over the parameters of the Shapley value for other properties like efficiency, right? And our surprising answer is no, for any given local welfare functions, W. Right? And because the slide looks really the same as the slide that I used last year for my candidacy, I want to point out that this is a much bigger no than last year's no. I'll try to take a couple of minutes later on to specifically point out the differences. Okay, so we're not the first ones to look at this problem. The inspiration for our work is this result. So what this result says is that there exists a W, there exists a local welfare function for which any budget balanced distribution rules that guarantee a pure Nash equilibrium for all games must be equivalent to generalized weighted Shapley values on W. Right? So our result says that for any W, not just a specific W, but for any set of different welfare functions, any distribution rules that guarantee a pure Nash equilibrium must be equivalent to generalized weighted Shapley values, not necessarily on W itself, but on some ground welfare functions W prime. And these W primes actually correspond to what is the actual welfare you're distributing, right? Because I relaxed budget balance. So just look at what the actual welfare that's being distributed by the rule is, and these distribution rules have to be weighted Shapley values on those functions. Right? And if budget balance is desired, if you want to impose it, then pick W prime to be the same as W. Okay? So yeah, so just to clarify, by all gains, I mean gains with fixed N, fixed W's, fixed choices of welfare functions and distribution rules. And this is just, I'm restating the results formally. And all that I want you to note is, so when I say that a distribution rule is equivalent to a generalized weighted Shapley value, what do I mean by that formally? It means that there exists a weight system for which the distribution rule at W and the generalized weighted Shapley value on omega are the same. Right? So that's what I mean. And here, what I mean by choosing ground welfare functions for the given set of welfare functions is that I'm requiring that there be a mapping. So in addition to the weight system, there should exist a mapping, GSV, that maps each function in W to a corresponding ground welfare function W prime, right? Such that FW is a generalized weighted Shapley value on W prime. And moreover, as I mentioned, this W prime is just the actual welfare that's distributed by FW. So this is, we have another equivalent characterization of our result. The first thing to notice about this result is we relaxed budget balance, but we still require that distribution rules are restricted to Shapley values. But I just introduced marginal contribution family of distribution rules, which are not budget balanced, but still guarantee equilibrium, right? So it turns out that we have an equivalent characterization in terms of generalized weighted marginal contributions as well. So what this says is that for any W, any distribution rules that guarantee a pure Nash equilibrium for all gains must be equivalent to generalized weighted marginal contributions on some ground welfare functions, W double prime. Right? So I want to keep these two notations different because I'll be connecting them later on. Okay. So this second result is actually a consequence of a deeper fundamental connection between Shapley values and marginal contributions. And to talk about that result, I have to briefly shift gears and talk about an alternate representation for the welfare functions in terms of linear combinations of inclusion functions. Right? So any welfare function can be represented as a linear combination of inclusion functions where the inclusion function W sub t is defined as follows. Right? So this says that Wt of S is 1 if T is a subset of S and 0 otherwise. Right? So in cooperative game theory, inclusion functions are identified with what are called unanimity games. Right? So why is this a unanimity game? This says that if the players, this says that for welfare to be generated, all players in T have to be present. So that's the intuition for why these are called unanimity games. Right? So this basis representation, if you will, was introduced by Shapley in 1953. So we will be using this representation for W frequently throughout. And under this representation, I'm going to denote by script T the set of contributing coalitions of W. So what do I mean by contributing coalitions? They are those subsets for which the corresponding coefficient here is non-zero. And script Q is going to denote the magnitude of these contributions of the contributing coalitions. Okay, so any W can be represented instead by just specifying script T and script Q. So here's the proposition now, the equivalence result. For any two welfare functions, W prime and W double prime, and any weight system, omega, generalized weighted Shapley values on W prime is the same as generalized weighted marginal contributions on W double prime, if and only if the set of contributing coalitions is the same, and for all of these contributing coalitions, their contributions, the magnitude of their contributions is related in this specific way. Okay? So let's call this map, right? In some sense, this is a mapping from W prime to W double prime. So let's call this map as H. And here's the formal statement of our second characterization in terms of marginal contribution. So here, I want you to notice that we have the parallel mapping that parallels the Shapley value result. So, but here we call the mapping G sub MC that maps each local welfare function to a corresponding ground welfare function. And what is this mapping GMC? It's precisely H of GSE of W, right? Where H is this bijection. Okay, so here's the promised part about distinguishing this result from last year's, because they look really similar on the slides. Okay, so last year our model was a lot different, right? So we had a single base welfare function that was scaled at each resource. We had a stronger scalability constraint. We had a restriction of submodularity on the welfare function. We also had a technical assumption to exclude zero weights in our characterization. And we imposed budget balance. And then we got this characterization, weighted Shapley values on W. So I'm going to now show how relaxing each of these assumptions changes this result, the effect of each of them. So now we have arbitrary welfare functions that you can pick for every resource. And that changes, it doesn't change anything except it says, okay, now you have to be weighted Shapley value on each of those different functions that you pick. Now we only require a weaker form of scalability. That doesn't change anything. We relax the submodularity assumption. That also doesn't change anything. But removing this technical assumption now allows for generalized weighted Shapley values as opposed to just Shapley values. And when we relax the budget balance assumption, you can now have generalized weighted Shapley values on some ground welfare function instead of the true welfare function. And yeah, so as a bonus, we get an equivalent characterization in terms of marginal contributions as well. Okay, so now we have these two characterizations. Let us take maybe a few minutes to look at what are the consequences of these characterizations on the other desirable properties that I showed you before, right? So we have this list of properties. Obviously, our distribution, the two distribution rules satisfy stability because we required it. But beyond that, both of them, as I mentioned, result in weighted or generalized weighted potential gains. And this actually means that potential gains are necessary to ensure pure Nash equilibria in our model of a broad class of Gaussian games. Right? And this is perhaps surprising because the class of potential games is a relatively small subclass of the class of games with pure Nash equilibria. And what this result says is that whether I require the game to be a potential game or requiring the game to have a pure Nash equilibrium makes no difference in terms of the characterization. And both the weighted Shapley value and the weighted marginal contribution on W prime and W double prime respectively where they are related by that mapping H, result in the same weighted potential gain with the same potential function, because I showed basically these two distribution rules are the same. That was the result on that slide. And so the potential function is the same, and in particular, the potential function is just W double prime, the ground welfare function of question of sorry.
So the gain has multiple W primes and W double primes, right? So instead of potential function equal to W double prime, what does that mean?
So if you choose a particular W prime and W double prime that are related according to this mapping, and you use that, and you use weighted marginal contribution on W double prime and Shapley value on W prime, your shares, the shares of the rules are going to turn out to be exactly the same numbers. So it's the same game. It turns out to be the same game, and they're both, yeah, it's a potential game, and the potential, then there's only one potential function. Now, there is a recursive form where you can express this potential function as a function of W prime for weighted Shapley values, but I'm saying instead, here's a very simple way you can just say that the potential function is W double prime, because if you restrict yourself to this, you know that for marginal contribution, the potential function is W double prime. So this actually provides a closed form expression, as I just explained, for the weighted Shapley value, which to the best of my knowledge is previously unknown. The expression that's currently there is some kind of a complex recursive formula for the potential. Okay, so I'm going to focus a little bit on two more consequences. One is the trade-off between efficiency and budget balance, and the other is the trade-off between budget balance and tractability. So our characterization imposes or provides a new structure on how you could go about optimizing for efficiency. So all you got to do now is optimize over these two parameters. Pick your ground welfare function, pick your weight system, and do, say, weighted Shapley on them. Right? If budget balance is required, then you have to set the ground welfare function to W. You don't have a choice there. You just optimize over the weights. And if budget balance is not required, it might seem that you still have to, these two parameters that you have to optimize over, but it turns out that a further reduction in the space of parameters is possible. In particular, we show that the weights don't matter in this case, and you just have to optimize over W prime. So it's nice that if you want budget balance, you just optimize over weights. If you don't require budget balance, just optimize over the ground welfare functions. So future work in this direction would be, can we obtain a more precise characterization of this trade-off, right? Because this is giving the two ends, the worst, both ends of the spectrum. Okay, so moving on to the trade-off between budget balance and tractability. So a design, if you want to use the Shapley value characterization to design your distribution rule, it provides control over budget balance because the ground welfare function you're using is the actual welfare that's distributed. But they are hard to compute. And if you want to use marginal contributions to design your distribution rules, it's tractable. However, the ground welfare function there is not the actual welfare distributed. So if you still want the advantage of tractability, but you want some control of budget balance, here's what you can do. You start with the desired W prime that you want to distribute, and then you use this transformation H to get W double prime, and on that W double prime you can then do your marginal contribution. Right? So it's not that you completely avoid the intractability by doing this, because H is an exponential time transformation. It requires you to scale the contributions of every unanimity gain, right? So the coefficient corresponding to every unanimity gain has to be scaled. But you can still think of it as just a pre-processing step, right? So you do this once at the beginning, and then every time you want to compute the utility, compute your distribution rule, you just do marginal contributions. Okay, so my last item on my agenda for this talk is a proof sketch of the main result. So the proof in the thesis is about 50 pages. And there is a shorter outline that I provide in the thesis, like a 5-page outline. But this is going to be a very, very abstract, high-level overview of what's happening in the proof. So, and also we're going to restrict ourselves to the case where you just have a single welfare function, right? Okay, so the first step is we're going to reduce the problem to characterizing just budget balance distribution rules, right? So from last year, we dropped the assumption of budget balance, but the first thing we do in the proof is we're saying that it is without loss of generality. Like we're going to reduce the problem to just characterizing budget balance distribution rules. So how do we do that? Notice that the welfare function does not directly affect the utilities or the cost shares of the players, right? It only does so through the distribution rule. So if you take these two classes where I just, the only thing that's different is the welfare function, W here and W prime here. They're the same for any W and W prime. All that matters is that the distribution rule has to be the same, the numbers that the players get out of the shares, right? Therefore, all I do is I'm going to pick my W prime now to be the actual welfare that's distributed by FW. So now FW is a budget balance distribution rule for W prime, right? So this just, it's a very quick but important reduction that we do at the beginning of the proof. And before going to the next stage, I just want to recall this basis representation of W as a linear combination of the inclusion functions, right? So we had this concept of a contributing coalition and the magnitude of the contribution of that coalition, right? So our proof technique, broadly speaking, is to establish a series of necessary conditions on FW, right? So we're going to ask what is required out of a distribution rule that wants to guarantee a Nash equilibrium for all games. And so we're going to write down a lot of necessary conditions, and by proving each one of them, we're going to eliminate some distribution rules until at the end we are left only with generalized weighted Shapley values. So that's the way the proof will proceed. And the way we establish these necessary conditions is by providing counterexamples, right? So if a distribution rule does not satisfy necessary condition A, then here is a game for which a Nash equilibrium will not exist, right? So that's the way each necessary condition proceeds. So let's first look at the proof when our welfare function is a single inclusion function, WT. So here, let's ask the question, what's required of F? There are two cases. Either T is not formed in S, in which case there is no welfare, right? And therefore there's nothing to allocate, so don't allocate the welfare to any player. Or T is formed in S, and there is a welfare of 1 that's generated, and you allocate welfare only to the players in T, because really only the players in T were necessary to get you that 1. And so independent of who else might be present. And it turns out that once we prove these two conditions, it's enough to show that now the distribution rule Ft is completely specified just by these size of T values, Ft and phi T values. And then from that, what I'm going to do is, given these Ft values, I'm going to construct a weight system such that Ft and the generalized weighted Shapley value with that weight system are going to be the same, right? And this is the construction of the weight system. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through that. Okay, so now let's come back to the final step, which is I'm going to try and prove the result for an arbitrary welfare function, right? So that has a combination of inclusion functions thrown in with coefficients, right? So again, we're asking the same question, and we have a similar set of possibilities here. Either no coalition from T is formed in S, in which case, again, there is no welfare and don't allocate anything, or at least one contributing coalition is formed. And in that case, again, it's the same intuition. You allocate welfare only to the contributing players, independent of the non-contributing players. And in this case, these two conditions are enough to guarantee that the desired distribution rule, you should be able to represent it as a linear combination of these basis distribution rules, where so each FT is a distribution rule corresponding to that particular inclusion function, WT. Okay, and this we already showed in the last slide, that you can write, you can find, you can build a weight system omega t such that this is the generalized weighted Shapley value. But these WT, these omega t's might be different for different inclusion functions, right? So the last step of the proof requires us to show this, that there is a universal weight system, omega star, that is equivalent to all the weight systems. Right? So what do I mean by equivalent? If for every t, if I take off omega t and replace it by omega star, nothing changes. The shares remain the same. Right? So that's what we do. Once we prove that, we're going to replace omega t with omega star everywhere. And now, because the weight system is the same, by linearity, this is just the generalized weighted Shapley value with weight system omega star. Okay, so the last thing I want to do is point out some key proof techniques which I think are generic and not specific to this particular framework, and could find applications in other related models as well. Right? So these are the two main things that I want to point out. One is the basis framework, and the other is an inclusion-exclusion framework. So the basis framework is crucial to the modular structure of our proof, right? Because it separates the following two steps of focusing just on the basis distribution rules, and that part can be done independent of the welfare function. All you're doing for that is looking at how your unanimity game is being played out, right? And you can separate that from a focus on consistency of these basis distribution rules. And that consistency now depends on the welfare function. It depends on the coefficients that you have. And what we do is we separate all possible coefficients into 3 to the 2 to the n minus 1 different cases that correspond to different sign combinations of the coefficients, right? So each coefficient can be positive, negative, 0. So, and there are 2 to the n minus 1 inclusion functions. And we provide a counterexample template for each case. And in addition to this ability to split this focus also allowed us to easily extend the proof to the case of multiple welfare functions. Right? So when we submitted this to EC, they said, we're not satisfied because we want to see the restriction to a single welfare function is very, seems to be a very hard restriction. And what we did in the rebuttal, we had 3 days, and I kept looking at the proof, and it turns out that it's this specific tool that the basis framework provides lets us to easily extend the proof to multiple welfare functions. And as I've already explained to you, it's the basis framework that exposes the fundamental equivalence of Shapley value and marginal contribution. We had to get into this framework for me to show you that result. And the inclusion-exclusion framework turns out to be crucial to show that distribution rules must be representable in the same basis framework as the welfare functions. And what it does specifically is that it helps us to build inductive counterexamples by singling out any desired inclusion function from an arbitrary welfare function. So you throw an arbitrary welfare function at me, I can construct a counterexample using this framework such that I can extract the effect of any unanimity gains that I want. And then show some properties on that, and then inductively show it for higher and higher inclusion functions. Okay, so now I'm going to conclude. So limitations of our characterizations. We did start out with our goal being a universal design. We wanted pure Nash equilibrium for all games with arbitrary resources and action sets. However, if the games that I'm interested in have more structure on the action sets, maybe they are all source destination paths on some graph, then our characterizations claim nothing. Particularly, there may be distribution rules other than generalized weighted Shapley and marginal contributions that guarantee pure Nash equilibrium. And indeed, it is the case, for example, in single selection coverage games, where players are restricted to just choosing one resource at a time. So future work can look at what is the structure on the action sets that causes this fundamental restriction to Shapley values. Right? It's not the welfare function, so it's some structure on the action sets. And extensions of our model, we can extend our model or try to extend our model to a field of mechanism design. So recall that the player's utility function was simply the sum of the cost shares at each resource. What if, in addition to that, players also had some private valuations over the set of outcomes, right? So you have this extra VI term. Now, if the private valuation only depends on his own action and the distribution rules, these FRs cannot depend on these values, then our model extends as is. But obviously, you expect that more efficient designs be possible if you let the distribution rules depend on the value. So you would add an additional desirable property to that laundry list, specifically incentive compatibility, because the system designer now has to ask the players for their private valuations. And they don't have to tell the truth. So how do you make them tell the truth? So challenging future work is, can we design efficient incentive compatible cost sharing mechanisms for such non-cooperative settings? And that concludes my talk. I'll take questions.
Okay, so we can take questions from the audience for a few minutes. If anybody wants to ask anything else? Yeah.
So what if the utility has a term, not a private valuation, so VIAI, but VI A minus I? Is that?
Yeah, so the VI, yeah, so that's a special case of just having VI of A, right? So
yeah. But specifically,
so
it doesn't depend on your choice.
It doesn't depend on your choice.
So is there anything that can be said?
I think in that case, if you're not able to control any part of the utility function that you don't control, you can just safely ignore that. So it's only if you have like a complex interaction between both your actions and the other people's actions that things get difficult.
I have a clarification question. I think you said it, but I missed it. So the efficiency, the price of vanity and price of stability, is the same as the Shapley value in your case?
So it's the same as, so in what context?
I guess you showed that the
equivalence between the Shapley value and marginal contribution.
Okay, so let's see. The consequence, when you talk about the consequence of your, yes, that's right, yes. Does that mean all the efficiency is exactly the same as the case of Shapley value? Nothing changed, your result doesn't change that?
So, I mean, I'm saying that the weights don't matter here. So what what weight system you're using to construct the Shapley value does not matter. I mean, I'm not saying that the distribution, the class of distribution rules is the same, but I'm saying that the effect of that on the price of anarchy is the same, or the price of stability is the same. So distribution rules do change. You do have scaling factors. The set of prices of anarchy of all the games in the class is going to be the same.
So it's not true that just because it's a potential game, you get the best possible equilibrium, right?
No, not if there could be multiple. I assume you're talking about marginal contribution, using the marginal contribution.
Just generally it's not true.
In general, yeah, so your first thing, your potential function has to be the same as the welfare function that you're maximizing. And number two, your potential function has to have a unique maximum.
So one of the most, the basic premise is that you want pure Nash equilibrium.
Yes. Yeah.
Is that, why is that so important?
That's a good question. I mean, we could relax it further. I mean, down. We could scale it down to asking for mixed or correlated equilibria. But in that case, existence is, especially like for finite games, existence is guaranteed. Right? So Nash's theorem guarantees existence of mixed Nash equilibria in this setting. Everything is closed. Action set is closed. Closed and compact. But so there, the concern would be on efficiency. Right? So, plus,
so the distribution rules are not an issue.
yeah, you could have any distribution rule. There will always be mixed Nash equilibrium. But as you relax the solution concept more and more, you also have more and more outcomes that satisfy that requirement. And then, if you want to analyze price of anarchy, price of stability trade-offs, that could get difficult. You have more of the outcomes there. Then you would want some way of refining it further.
Other questions? Okay, in that case, everybody except the committee should leave, and we'll have the committee questions.